This program made possible in part by grants from the UCF College of Health and Public Affairs, which promotes excellence in undergraduate and graduate education, research, and community service in health-related professions and public affairs. And the UCF College of Medicine, where our goal is to become America's leading partnership medical school and a national leader in medical education and research. And the UCF College of Nursing, which offers high-quality, innovative academic programs that reflect the healthcare needs of a changing population and meet the needs of today's students.
Hello everyone, welcome to For Your Health. I'm Ed Hyland.
And I'm Charna Davis-Wiese. On today's show, a devastating type of injury has launched a completely unique solution at UCF. Students suffering traumatic brain injury can now receive life-changing help right on campus.
I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo. Traumatic brain injury is a lot more common than you might expect, but UCF has a new, unique program designed to help. I'll have that story.
The types of accidents that can cause traumatic brain injury could also cause paralysis, but some exciting advances are bringing new hope to patients in that area as well. But first, an update on the latest in UCF Health.
For hundreds of college-age students, the unexpected can bring the unthinkable, traumatic brain injury. For one Central Florida student, the unexpected was a car accident. The unthinkable was severe brain damage. But then the unthinkable happened again. She recovered. Alicia Callanan Mandigo has the story.
We think of college students as being at the top of their game, but research has shown that's not always the case. A lot of college students battle a hidden ailment, traumatic brain injury, otherwise known as TBI.
The situation is really quite scary. There's been good research conducted on a number of college campuses around the United States, and all of the studies find essentially the same thing, and that is between 15 and 20% of the students on their campus have had a head injury that affects the student in some way. They are at risk to fail out.
Lots of times the student has no idea he has TBI. A childhood fall that knocks you out is all it takes. For that reason, Dr. Larry Schutz launched a first-of-its-kind TBI program at UCF. Amanda Patrick is a stunning example of how Dr. Schutz can help. An honors student in high school, she was in a devastating car accident that left her in a coma for 17 days.
Amanda's brain is pretty much wrecked by what the injury did to her. If she used it the way you use yours, she would be in deep trouble. She would be able to live a very basic life, but probably not hold a job.
Instead, Amanda is today a graduate student at UCF. It's because she received cognitive rehabilitation. Among the effects of her TBI is that she has no short-term memory. Cognitive rehabilitation taught her how to get around that.
What I do is, after I take notes in class, I transfer them over to something called a self-test, which I learned in my therapy at Burke. And that's when you form questions out of the material, and then you put the answer on the back. However, my sophomore year of college, it got to be annoying because even getting to the fifth question, I couldn't remember what the answer was to the first question anymore. I said, you know what? I'm just going to put all of the information in the question and make it a yes or no answer, and I just look at it, and through repetition, I'm going to learn the material.
It took Amanda about 4 months to graduate from Dr. Schutz's program, but she's not considered recovered. Recovery is actually a lifelong process.
She learned the principles of how to fix her brain. That's what I teach my patients. I teach them how their brain works, what's gone wrong, what they need to do to fix it. And then Amanda has custom tailored her strategies to each task that she's accomplishing in her life. And each new task requires a little bit different application of these principles.
But what Dr. Schutz teaches isn't available to all TBI patients, which is one of the reasons he's launched the new TBI program at UCF. Amanda hopes it will bring new understanding across the board.
I feel brain injury awareness is lacking. People don't really have a thorough understanding of it. They don't understand that if you get a severe enough concussion, it can change your life in the worst ways, and if you don't know how to properly address how to fix yourself, you're screwed.
I'm Alicia Callanan Mandigo for your health.
The type of therapy Amanda received can cost as much as $70,000, but in Florida, a special state fund helps to pay for TBI rehabilitation.
Amanda Patrick's story is amazing in and of itself, but her experience has helped to put UCF in a very unique position. UCF is the only university with a traumatic brain injury program on campus.
Joining us today is Dr. Larry Schutz, who is the director for the Traumatic Brain Injury Program. Thanks for joining us. You know, when you hear traumatic brain injury, it almost makes the impression that it has to be catastrophic. And not all brain injury is necessarily catastrophic. It can be mild and still change the way you function, can't it?
Yes, even an injury that causes a few minutes of unconsciousness or just makes the person dazed has the potential to have some long-lasting effects, although most people who have those kinds of injuries come away without lasting symptoms. But injuries that most of us would not be worried about, an injury that causes an hour or two of unconsciousness, after which the person wakes up and seems reasonably okay, can produce life-changing effects.
So it can be long-lasting, even though, as you mentioned, someone is just out for a couple of moments. I mean, I guess most people do think in terms of perhaps a stroke patient, someone who has had major brain damage. You don't think of that little bump on the head as being something that would be severe enough to actually cause a brain injury that lingered on.
Yes, and now I want to make sure that people understand, you know, if you're going to the refrigerator and your roommate opens the freezer door and hits you in the head, it doesn't mean you have brain damage and you need to be concerned. But a blow to the head that's strong enough to change your level of consciousness or to render you unconscious even for a relatively brief period of time is enough to damage brain cells, and those damaged brain cells are no longer available for the rest of your life. And many people have the false impression that the brain can somehow heal itself or somehow do a workaround, wire around damaged cells, and that's really inaccurate. So once brain cells have been lost, you have to work with a brain that has fewer connections. And depending on what those connections are, the effects can be quite serious.
You talk about the brain connections. I once did a 2-hour show on the brain, and I think I needed 200 hours. And it was a very, very old book I was reading, and it was a quote of saying the brain was like a box locked with 1,000 locks, and inside there are 1,000 boxes to try to figure out how it works. And that's part of the problem in diagnosing and finding what's wrong, isn't it? And why a bump on the head could affect a different person or different injury a different way.
The difficulty in understanding brain injury comes from the fact that we don't have any medical tests that can look closely enough at how the brain is functioning to detect most of the serious effects of an injury, because most of the effects are microscopic. When the brain gets hit, a wave of pressure passes through it, very much like a tidal wave moving across the ocean. And as it does so, it snaps certain cells right in the middle, and those cells die. But it's one cell here, one cell there, and the medical tests can't look at one cell at a time. Now, An autopsy can do that, and we learned 100 years ago that brain injuries have very serious effects at a single cell level. And over the last 100 years, the autopsy techniques have improved to the point where we have a very precise understanding of what these injuries do, too late to do anything about them. The problem for a living person is that the medical tests don't detect the problem. They don't detect the symptoms.
And we're going to take just a short break. We'll be back to talk more with Dr. Schutz, but first let's take a quick look at UCF's Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. We're back once again talking about traumatic brain injury. Dr. Larry Schutz is joining us, and again, thank you for being with us. And I wanted to ask a little bit about what you were saying earlier concerning some of the tests and trying to evaluate patients. Are any two patients actually alike? I mean, you may have, if I go to the doctor and I have a cold, I'm treated generally the same way as the next person that comes in with a cold. But do you do that with traumatic brain injury patients?
That question has caused more confusion over the last 100 years than any other.
Which is why I asked it.
Yeah, so you're creating the proper confusion for us today. We know that when these waves of pressure pass through the brain, that the direction from which they come and the shape of the inside of the skull and the size of the brain is, each of those things is going to make it's going to place different cells at risk. So no two injuries injure exactly the same set of brain cells. And people used to think that that meant that every head injury is unique like a fingerprint, and therefore that you really can't make any general statements about head injuries. What we discovered was that regardless of where the waves come from, there are certain parts of the brain that are very vulnerable to damage. Anytime you have a large, thick component of the brain sitting next to something else, a difference in density, when the wave passes through, it's going to twist this element against this element and cause damage right at the point where it twists. And so there are certain structures in the brain that are almost always damaged no matter where the problem comes from. If you can imagine, if there was a huge tidal wave that came at us in Orlando from any direction, obviously it would do damage to different suburbs in different ways. But when the wave crashed over the city, there'd be certain buildings that would come down no matter what. And that's the way it works inside the brain.
And perhaps for people to understand a little bit about how the brain works itself, when the research I've always done it, I almost pictured it like phone lines for the entire world, with the communication coming and going in particular areas, and you just break one, that communication is cut off. You may not feel pain, you may not be able to feel emotion, or depending on where it is.
I like to compare the way the brain works to the communication structure in a city. There are buildings in which ideas are generated, and then the ideas are sent out over phone lines to other buildings. And so the brain has computing circuits. You could compare those to the buildings. And most of the brain is composed of these interconnection lines. And when you have a traumatic brain injury, there are certain buildings, there are certain computing centers that are very likely to get damaged, and there are certain sets of transmission lines that are very likely to get damaged. And those two things together produce the signature problems of traumatic brain injury that you find in 90% or more of people who have these injuries. So in a sense, there's an economy in treating these problems, because there are certain problems that are vexing almost everyone who has the injury. And these are presenting the big problems for college students when they try to complete their studies.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about Amanda's case in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break and talk more with Dr. Schutz. We'll be back in just a moment. And we're back talking about traumatic brain injury, and one of the things that is mentioned in Amanda's case that we saw just a few moments ago is cognitive rehabilitative therapy. Give us a little idea, if you would, of this broad subject. You're somewhat of a pioneer in this area, and what it means, and perhaps to Amanda's case specifically, but in more general terms as well.
Until the mid-1970s, we had no reason to believe that we could help victims of traumatic brain injury to be able to think effectively again. Cognitive rehabilitation therapy is therapy for thinking. And the most serious problems that occur after a traumatic brain injury are changes in how the person thinks. What makes this especially difficult for the survivors and family members, for professors, counselors, and therapists alike, is that the person doesn't feel that their thinking has changed at all. As far as they can tell, everything's working fine, and in fact, if you raise the question, have you had some trouble with your thinking, they're likely to come back angrily and say, no, I'm fine. What are you talking about? So it's a hidden problem, but it's very obvious when you test someone that the injury has produced some serious problems in thinking. The two things that most need to be dealt with are problems in new learning and problems in a kind of high impact, high criticality self-organization. I mean, I hate to put all those words together, but let me try to make it a little simpler. When a situation comes up that's very challenging, when it's new or different, when high stakes are on the line, when you have to do something very hard, then you really need to think about what you're doing. And there's a special brain network that kicks in at those moments and brings the most advanced parts of your brain into play. That network monitors your need for this special thinking ability and turns itself on. And that's the network that gets most damaged when those waves of pressure pass through the brain, because those communication fibers that connect the processing centers, those get torn through badly enough that this system literally shuts down. Now, the communication may be down, but the actual processing centers are still okay. But because the system is no longer active, it no longer picks up the need to stop and think things through. And so people tend to kind of fly by the seat of their pants when they go into critical situations. This is when they make mistakes. But if you think about it from the perspective of a student, this is the difficult final exam. This is the oral report in class. This is trying to bail yourself out in the class you're failing. This is what happens when your roommate says, you've got to leave, I can't stand you anymore. These are the moments when you need to be at your best. These are the moments when the brain doesn't help, when it doesn't do what it used to do before the injury.
But with your therapy, you can train someone to work around that?
Yes, basically they need to learn two things. First, they need to learn to deliberately recognize what these critical situations are. Now, that's not a tall order. If you think about when are the times I really need to think hard, you could make up a perfectly good list, so could they. The problem is they don't have a self-alerting system for that. So they have to actually plan ahead for those situations. They have to make up a daily plan every day, and when they get to a point when they need to use those critical thinking skills, they need to put a little red asterisk there that says, this is where I need to turn on my best stuff. When they reach that moment, then they have to mobilize full concentration and even emotion. And when they do that, it lights up this sleeping system, and they become able to think things through just as well as they could before their injury. So the effect is remarkable, but you can only get it one way. They have to see trouble coming, and then they have to know how to crank up their mental energy and mental effort to a high level on a deliberate basis in a way that people normally don't have to do it.
Amazing.
That's about all you say. Amazing. We could listen to you all day, and we would love to have you come back and join us to talk more about traumatic brain injury.
I'd be delighted.
Thank you, Larry. Well, we always look forward to hearing what's new with the UCF College of Medicine. Here is the latest.
Well, the med school's moving forward on many fronts. We're looking at the applications from our first class. We have created a team of medical school faculty, both volunteer faculty and regular faculty, who will be interviewing the students as they come in, and those are starting almost immediately. We really want this medical school to belong to all of us. So we have a group of individuals interviewing who are clinical physicians and scientists, those who are on the UCF payroll and those who are our volunteers, and we put them through a training session so that they know what we're looking for in medical students, and they also know enough about the medical school's programs to represent us well to the applicants. We have quite a pool of applicants. We've really exceeded our wildest expectations in numbers and quality. We are looking at a full day with the students who are invited to the campus for an interview, and that day will include a tour of the facilities on the university campus that will be taking them out to Lake Nona, and they will also have the opportunity to visit with one of our hospital partners. And so we'll get a really good look at them. And we're looking for students whose heads work well and who also have the heart for medicine.
Christopher Reeve's courageous battle against paralysis gave us a few glimpses at the progress being made with paralysis patients. Researchers are still pushing the envelope, and in some cases, they're even reversing paralysis.
This comes from Matthew 9.
Faith in God has gotten Brandon Ingram through the toughest times.
My faith is through the roof.
Times like the biggest obstacle of his life, which left him paralyzed from the waist down.
I mean, I went through the windshield of my car coming off the interstate. They found me 50 feet away from my car.
Doctors told him he'd never walk again.
I mean, you could tell me anything, but nah, not that. You know, I'm not gonna be able to walk again. Yeah, right.
Researcher Richard Borgens is also trying to prove those doctors wrong. He implanted this experimental device called an oscillating field stimulator into Brandon's back 4 days after the accident. It sends out electricity, causing nerve fibers to grow.
Since World War II, there's been no medical therapy to recover functions in people that have spinal cord injuries. We had to sort of just dream about what we might like to do. Now, those dreams are realities.
Brandon is dreaming big, too. He has gradually regained movement, first feeling his toes again. And now he's even been able to raise his leg. But don't tell him he's lucky.
Yeah, I feel blessed. I mean, lucky is hitting the lottery. Lucky is, I feel blessed.
Blessed by his family and what he can still do. Hoping to someday shoot that three-pointer standing up. This is Jennifer Matthews reporting.
I'm letting them now, you miss.
A generation ago, very few scientists studied paralysis because the idea of a cure was so out of reach. Paralysis research was considered a dead-end path to follow. Certainly not the case today. And that's going to do it for us today. I'm Charna Davis-Wiese.
And I'm Ed Highland. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time on For Your Health.